Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Amirsh Raje. Today we'll be talking about real-world testing with Sync Gateway. The focus of this presentation is going to be the Couchbase Sync Gateway and how we go about testing with the Sync Gateway and the Couchbase mobile suite in general, right? So just a quick background about myself. Like I said, my name is Amirsh Raje. I'm a principal with Infosys. I've been with Infosys for around 20 years, and I've been involved in various application modernization projects. I'm currently leading a major transformation for a retail client where we're implementing Couchbase Mobile to sync data between a handheld iOS device and the server, right? So that's a brief background about me. In terms of today's agenda, we'll be talking about all the challenges that you will probably run into while testing mobile sync with Couchbase. And then we'll talk about my solutions or recommendations to overcome those challenges. And most of this is going to be based on, the kind of issues that I ran into or I faced at multiple engagements working with Couchbase Mobile, right? We will talk about how we went about doing functional testing with Sync Gateway and Couchbase Mobile. We'll talk about performance testing. We'll also talk about how we monitored various metrics from Couchbase, right? Both the server side as well as Sync Gateway. So that's the agenda for today. All right. Overview of Couchbase Mobile. So what exactly is Couchbase Mobile? I'm not going to spend too much time here talking about this one. There are a lot of great sessions on Couchbase Connect that take a deep dive into Couchbase Mobile. So I would encourage you to take advantage of those sessions to understand Couchbase Mobile. But just to quickly summarize, right? Couchbase Mobile is a mobile sync technology that enables sharing data between a server-side Couchbase cluster and various IoT devices or mobile handheld devices on the edge. So it's basically a synchronization engine, if you will, right? And like I said, there are two parts to it. There's Couchbase Lite, which runs on the handheld devices or the edge devices, and then there is Sync Gateway, which is the engine which synchronizes data between the server and the handheld devices. Most of you are here to talk about, or hear about testing. So I'm sure you have this overview. So I'm going to keep it short. Let's jump into, Sync Gateway testing, how we go about doing it, the challenges that I ran into, right? So let's start about talking about the most obvious challenge here, right? Generally speaking, what I've seen is mobile app development teams are different from server-side teams. They tend to follow their own schedule. They have their own priorities. It's not very uncommon to hear the mobile app development team prioritizing maybe something like a UI UX design for their app and leaving the server side, or rather leaving the sync development for later in the game, right? So from a server side, it's very common for teams to say, I want to design the data model. I want to start building my ingestion layer to bring in all the data into the Couchbase cluster. They would start setting up their sync gateways ahead of time, start working on all the mobile synchronization logic within Sync Gateway, right? Data routing logic, how the sync function gets designed, and all of that, right? So without a real mobile app available for you to start testing, how do you go about, making sure that all the rules that you have implemented on Sync Gateway kind of do what they're supposed to do, right? So that's the first challenge that we'll be talking about today, right? How do you test without a mobile app? Then the other, challenge that I don't want you would call it challenge, maybe another aspect of testing is, let's say you have the mobile app ready to start testing. You will commonly run into a scenario where the mobile team comes to you and says, hey, I don't see this doc on my device. What gives, right? Why is that doc not available to the mobile? Is it not present on the server? Did it not sync to the mobile device? Or did it sync, but it was probably filtered out by a replication filter on the mobile device? Or did it sync and it's present in the mobile device in the database, the CBLite database, but the app UI does not show it for some reason, right? So these are a lot of scenarios that you're going to run into. Wouldn't it be nice to have a tool or some sort of a way to validate these things and say, hey, this document is syncing on the channel that you're trying to sync on, right? So the document is flowing through. Maybe there's a different problem that we need to look at. And obviously there are logs that you will, look at and do more debugging. But sometimes it's just good to use a tried and tested tool to say, here, with this user, I did a sync. Here's what the documents I'm getting. If you don't see them on the mobile app, well, there's probably a bug on your mobile app or something that you need to look at on the mobile side, right? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more on how do you go about doing this kind of testing. Another thing to consider, right? Let's say you've completed your functional testing. You're sure that Sync Gateway and the mobile app works as expected. So what's next, right? Obviously, you want to do some level of performance testing to validate that your Sync Gateway sizing is correct and that it can handle the load that you're going to put on it in production, right? So let's say you have a large user base, right? And you expect 40K concurrent connections to the Sync Gateway. How do you simulate that, right? The most common answer that I get when I ask this question is, we'll probably use something like JMeter or load runner, right, to simulate a load on the server. Well, those tools work. They work great for REST APIs, right? But they don't work for Couchbase mobile sync. And the reason is, for you to be able to sync data with Couchbase mobile, you need a CBLite client, right? And a JMeter or a load runner is not a CBLite client. You need something different, right? You need an application that can do the synchronization with the Sync Gateway server. So we'll talk about, options that you have to make this happen. I'll show you a couple of demos, and talk about different options that you may have. All right, so that's quite a lot that we have to cover, right? So let's move on and start talking about functional testing with Sync Gateway first, right? We'll talk about functional, and then we'll jump on to performance. All right. Functional testing, right? So what are the typical things that you will do as a part of your functional testing? The most obvious thing is to ensure that documents sync to a device, right? But there's a little bit more than that, right? We can make sure that when a document lands in a bucket in Couchbase, Sync Gateway went through its import process and actually imported that document, right? The sync function is going to be invoked the moment a document lands in your bucket. It's going to apply all your rules, right, on the document. Maybe you're doing channel assignments that are defined in the sync function. They're going to get applied, right? So what we can do is, take a look at the channel assignment information that's stored in the meta section of a document, right? There is a section within the meta attributes of a document called the xatters _ sync section. If you look at that, you will see a property called channels, right? And it will be valued. So that's something that you can look on the server side, make sure that your channel assignment is happening properly, right? So unless your channels are assigned properly, there's just no way that a document is going to sync to your device. So that's the first thing that you obviously want to test, right? But the most important thing is, just do an actual sync and see if your documents that you expected to sync to a device are actually syncing. right? And then we have a few options here to do things. I'm going to be talking about two options. There is a tool called a Couchbase CLI, right? This is something that Couchbase provides. It's a Couchbase Labs tool, right? You can obviously use that. It's a CLI tool that allows you to do a data sync, right? It works for the most part. The second option is a CBLite Tester tool. This is a tool that I wrote and open sourced. It's available to download from the Infosys GitHub repo for the CBLite Tester tool. So we will be doing a quick demo and looking at both these options, right? But so this is the GitHub URL where you can download the CBLite CLI tool from Couchbase Labs, and then this one here, you can download the Couchbase Lite Tester tool from the Infosys repo. So those are your two options, and we'll talk about that. So let's do a demo of the CBLite Tester tool. All right. Now that we saw the demo, let's look at performance testing with the Sync Gateway. All right. Now, when we say performance testing, there's a little bit more than just performance testing, right? We generally talk about performance testing, we talk about load testing, we talk about endurance testing. They're kind of different things, right? When you talk about a load test, you're generally talking about I have 40K concurrent connections on my Sync Gateway. Can my Sync Gateway handle that kind of load, right? So that's your typical load testing. Endurance testing is I have 40K concurrent connections, and those connections are persistent. They're going to be constantly hitting the Sync Gateway for, 2 hours, right? So that's your endurance testing. Can my Sync Gateway handle an extended load for a longer period of time? And then the whole thing, right, together, we kind of call it performance testing. But how quickly is my document syncing to the mobile, right? Those kind of things. The whole point of doing this is to ensure that your Sync Gateway cluster is sized appropriately, right? You don't want to be in production and then realize that your Sync Gateways cannot handle as many concurrent connections, or the documents are syncing to the mobile at a very slow speed because there's just so much going on, right? And it's not just the Sync Gateways, it's also the Couchbase cluster itself that you need to worry about. Because at the end of the day, Sync Gateways may be reading data using the nickel and query service on the Couchbase cluster, right? So your cluster also has to be sized appropriately. And that's why we go and do these performance tests, right? Also, one thing to keep in mind is there are a lot of network components like application gateways, firewalls, etc. in the path before you are going to hit your Sync Gateway, right? And it's the most common pattern, right? You're going to have an application gateway in front, you're going to have a firewall, probably have some internal load balancers, and then you have the Sync Gateway, right? We've seen multiple instances where Couchbase components are sized properly, they're tuned properly, everything is awesome. But then the other network components that I just talked about are inadequately provisioned, right? And they buckle under heavy load. So the point here is, when you do your performance testing, load testing, what have you, you go end to end, just like you would in production, right? You just don't want to put your load against Sync Gateway, do your testing and say, hey, my Sync Gateway is fine, only to find out that there's a problem with the firewall, right? It just couldn't handle the load in production. So it's important that you do an end-to-end test rather than, just a point-to-point kind of a test. All right. So let's start talking about, how do you go about testing Sync Gateway with multiple users, right? But the first order of business is to figure out how many concurrent connections are you going to have. Note that concurrent connections is not the same as concurrent users, right? So you can have situations where your application, the mobile application, opens multiple replications with Sync Gateway at the same time. So for example, your app may want to do a continuous sync on a specific channel, and then for everything else, there's a one-shot channel, right? And also, you could have situations where there's a separate channel for pull, and there's a separate channel for pushing data. And all of these replicators may be running concurrently, right? So it's critical that you get a count of the total number of users and the total number of concurrent replications that you're going to run in production. For one implementation I worked on, we had a requirement to support 40K concurrent connections. Right? So how do you go about simulating 40K concurrent connections or concurrent users? You obviously cannot have 40K mobile devices running the test. Right? It's just not possible. Cloud providers like AWS, Azure, etc., they have device farms, where you can kind of rent devices for some time. You can run your scripts on physical devices, right? Well, this works for regression testing your application, and as a part of a CI/CD build or something. These things are really not meant for performance testing. I mean, you're going to have a very hard time trying to get 20K devices on AWS Device Farm. It is just not meant for this kind of stuff. So what's your next option, right? Load generators like JMeter, like I said, they're not going to work with CBLite. You're going to need something like the CBLite CLI tool or something else, right, to start the sync. So we'll talk about what are your choices for doing a true performance test, right? Couple of things, right? In my experience, what I started doing is I wrote a Java-based code for emulating whatever your mobile devices are going to do, right? So CBLite has a Java SDK. So putting together a Java-based utility was easy enough, right? The challenge that we ran into with Java is those utilities tend to be heavy, right? We ran into issues where we had several load generators, and we ended up maxing out either on CPU or memory on our load generator machines themselves. They simply couldn't scale up to running 40K concurrent connections. And we had to keep adding more and more load generators. And we went as high as 64 core machines. And yet we were running into client-side issues where either it would just max out of memory, max out of CPU or something, and the test would fail, right? Because obviously the CBLite client cannot connect to the server because there's no CPU available on the load generator. It's not going to work. So the other option that we kind of can use is to use something like the CBLite CLI utility from Couchbase, right? You can use that to run replications. What I ended up doing is, wrapping that utility around in a Python script. It was a very lightweight Python script, and I would just, invoke that Python script. It would go run the CBLite CLI command in the background and do a sync for up to 40K concurrent users, and that worked pretty well for us, right? And you don't have to always, you don't have to just rely on Python for this. You could do it in n number of different ways, right? Because at the bottom line is you're using the Couchbase CLI tool to sync. And obviously, there are process sampler applications within or plugins within JMeter. You can use that too, and that'll work as well. So having talked about how you go about doing the sync, either using a custom utility or using one of the CBLite CLI tools that you have, I want to kind of talk about a few learnings, right? So one of the things that you need to keep in mind is Sync Gateway replication uses WebSockets. Most organizations do not have a lot of expertise working with WebSockets as such. They're very comfortable using HTTP and REST. When it comes to WebSockets, you run into challenges, and a lot of the challenges are related to infrastructure not being tested to work with WebSockets. Right? There may need to be some tuning. For example, you may need to configure timeouts to make sure that there is a persistent CB replication is not toned down by a network appliance. Right? We ran into issues where our application gateway had a timeout, right? And it just would break down a connection, and it wouldn't just let the continuous replication run for more than 10 minutes. We never ran into problems with one-shot connections, but it's the concurrent, the continuous connections that we simply couldn't hold on for a long time. That was one challenge that I ran into. Another challenge is, so one more challenge that I've run into another client is they had a global load balancer, and it simply did not support WebSockets, right? So you need to be aware of these things and use the right alternatives. Another interesting problem that I ran into very recently is we had an application gateway, and the application gateway had a bug in it, right? It had a memory leak. And it used to work perfectly fine for HTTP traffic, right? Because the traffic is short-lived. You call an API, you get a response back, you're done. And it did not even affect Couchbase sync when we were doing one-shot replications, because you do a replication, you exchange data, you break down the connection, you're good. But when we were running continuous connections, the app gateway just could not sustain that continuous connection because of that memory leak. It would run out of memory, and then it would just break down all the connections and restart them. So where I'm going with all of this is, the bottom line is, test your application and test it just the way it would run in production, and then go beyond, right? Just test all your test all your edge cases, just to be sure that you don't run into production issues. So I think that's all I have for you from a performance testing standpoint. What I also want to kind of talk about is, how do you monitor Sync Gateway, or how do you monitor Couchbase, and what are some of the important metrics that you want to look at, right? For functional testing, obviously the main goal is to ensure that you're syncing the right data. So you're going to look at how many documents synced and all of that stuff, right? But beyond that, from a performance testing standpoint, what do you monitor, and how do you monitor, right? So let's talk about the how do you monitor first. So there are a couple of ways to do that, right? There is a metric endpoint in Sync Gateway that provides metrics in a Prometheus format, and you can easily use that to import your metrics into Prometheus and Grafana, right? This is an option that was introduced with, I think, Sync Gateway 2.8. So this is the recent addition. And then there is the older way of doing this, right? Which is still available on the newer versions of Sync Gateway, which is the _expvar endpoint, right? You call that endpoint, it gives you metrics in a JSON format. You could directly integrate this endpoint into your monitoring tool of choice and visualize the operational metrics, right? There's also a Sync Gateway exporter provided by Couchbase Labs. You can use that too. It can connect to Sync Gateway, it can supply you metrics, and then you can import them into Grafana or whatever visualization tool you want. And then obviously, there are third-party options. One option that we use for a retail client is MetricBeat. So MetricBeat is a part of the Elastic cloud. So we run MetricBeat. It's got plugins for Couchbase. It's able to export Couchbase metrics into ECE or Elastic Cluster, and then we visualize those metrics in Kibana, right? So that's another option for you. Either ways, right? So let's talk about what do you monitor, right? We once you bring everything into your visualization tool, right? What do you look at? What do you monitor? Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is CPU utilization, right? memory utilization. Those are the most common things that anybody would monitor. Obviously, you don't want your Sync Gateway CPU to go too high. How high is too high? Well, depends. I like to keep it around 60% max, but people have different opinions, right? Some people are okay going up to 80%. Some people don't want to go above 40%, right? So that's a call that you need to make depending on your volume and your expectations. Obviously, you want to look at memory utilization, but then the catch here is, Sync Gateway. Think of Sync Gateway as a large cache, right? So it's not. Well, you want Sync Gateway to utilize as much memory as it can, because it's storing all your documents and your channels and what have you in memory. Right? That's what you want. So it's not like just because your memory utilization is growing high, you have a problem. You also need to look at your heap memory utilization and other aspects to make sure that memory is being utilized properly and is being released. So for example, your heap memory gets released after your sync stop, right? And those kind of things. Some of the other things that you want to look at, active replications by type. Again, that's one metric that Sync Gateway will provide you. It will tell you how many replications are going on at any point of time. And it'll so in conjunction with that metric, there is another metric called replications caught up. And that's a very important metric to look at, because it tells you how many users have caught up or received all the changes that there were, for that particular user. So what you want to do is, look at your active replications by type, and then see how many of those replications have caught up, and how quickly do they get caught up, right? So that'll tell you how long it's taking for Sync Gateway to catch up, or the CBLite to catch up with all the replications that there is on the Sync Gateway. I also found it useful to monitor cache utilization, right? So with Sync Gateway, there are two types of caches. There's a rev cache and there's a channel cache. A channel cache is literally what it says, right? It's a cache of all channels. And then rev cache is where your documents kind of get cached. What's typically useful is to calculate the cache ratio, right? So you basically do a rev hit upon rev hit plus rev misses, right? And you calculate a ratio. And what that tells you is how much percentage of your documents or channels are being served out of a cache, out of the Sync Gateway cache, versus Sync Gateway having to constantly go back to the Couchbase server, run a nickel query, get all the documents, and then give it to the device, right? What you want is very high hits and low misses, right? So you want to try and optimize that ratio. And then, from a tuning standpoint, you can start looking at tweaking some of the cache configurations, like cache size, the number of documents to cache, etc. And unless you're really familiar with how to do that, I would recommend that you get help from someone who understands Sync Gateway, maybe Couchbase, or an SI partner like Infosys, and we'd be able to help you sort of tune these things properly, right? It's very critical that you don't do stuff that you don't understand. Obviously, in test. Right? There's no way out. So test everything out, right? There's no one size fits all kind of a thing here. So you have to test what works for your use case. So having looked at functional testing, kind of want to talk about how do we go about doing that. I'm going to show you a couple of demos on how best to do this. What I have here is a small Couchbase cluster hosted on my website. And I have an instance of Sync Gateway also reading from this bucket, right? So there is a bucket called My Bucket. It's got a bunch of documents in here. These are all dummy documents, but then for the purpose of the demo, it should just work fine, right? So let's say there are a bunch of fields that you have, and then I have a property here called $channel, right? And then I have a Sync Gateway function, and what that Sync Gateway function is doing is, if there is a property called $channels within the document, whatever value that we have, right? It takes that value and it creates a channel out of it. And then the users can sync data from these documents, right? So pretty straightforward, pretty simple. So we're going to talk about two ways to do your testing, right? We'll start with the simple way using a CBLite CLI tool. Like I said, there is this CBLite CLI tool. It's a CLI tool available from Couchbase. There's a Mac version, a Windows version, as well as a Linux version, right? Feel free to use that. And then what you do with that tool is pretty simple, right? You go in and you run a command like this. So CBLite, CP is for copy. You put in your credentials, and then there's this flag called BIDI or bidirectional. It's an optional flag. If you don't put this, it's always going to be a pull replication. You put this and it's going to be a two-way sync, right? And then what I've done here is put in the URL of my sync gateway, and then I'm pointing it to a local CBLite file, right? And for the most part, right, this works. And I'm going to just run this in the terminal. One moment. So I'm going to paste this here. It's going to sync. It pulls some 998 documents from the server, right? And then once you have that, what you do is you can pretty much run a list command. And then if you put a -- pretty flag, it's going to print out all the documents for you. You kind of go through, look at these documents, inspect if everything is fine. As you would recognize, right? This kind of testing, while it works, it's not very intuitive. It's not, if you have testers who are not technologically savvy, they just do QA testing. Working with a CLI tool is not always the best approach, right? But then, for the most part, this works. This is just one option, right? The other option that I wanted to quickly talk about is the CBLite Tester tool. So this is something that I developed. We have open sourced it on the Infosys GitHub. You're more than welcome to download the tool, use it, for free. And obviously, the source is open source. Source code is open source, so you can take this tool, modify it to, suit your requirements, and use it as well. So that works too. And there are a lot of things that this tool does. So I'll sort of talk about a few aspects here, and then there's documentation. You can explore that. Right? You can always reach out to me if you have questions. So the first thing I would do is just go into settings. I would set up my Couchbase URL here. So it's amrishraj.com. We're listening on port 4984. I put in a database name. It's called my HGDB. So this is the database that was set up on the sync gateway, right? I can do both WS and WSS. If you have certificates, you have enabled SSL on your sync gateway. You can put in your cert here, choose WSS, that will work too. Provide a link to, or rather the path to where you want to store the CBLite file. And then optionally, you can put in an admin port here. Now this is optional, you don't have to do this. But if you have exposed your admin API for sync gateway outside of your VM, you can put those things here. You could always put in credentials if you want, using at the username password in front of the URL. That works too, right? So once you have your settings all set up, you just put in your user password, and then you sync, right? And it's going to pull down all the documents. When it pulls down all the documents, it does not necessarily show you the contents of each document, because sometimes, you can have a lot of data, you can have a lot of documents, it can slow down to load all these documents. But you can always click the load full documents button here, and it's just going to load the entire document there. You can click on it, visualize any of the documents, right? You can go and make changes to any of the documents through this. You can search, right? And it will highlight what you want, what you searched for, right? You can put in attachments, like I said. If you modify a document, you can obviously push up those changes to the server. So what this will let you do is, if you look at the replication mode here, you can test out pull replication, push replication, as well as pull and push replication. So I could make a change to a document, click on push, and then push that change to the server. And you should be able to see that change reflected immediately on the server, right? So as an example, let's just pick up this document. I'm going to copy this. Let's say I go into field number 38 and I change this, put in my name, save it here. Oh, the JSON was malformed. We tell you that. Corrected it, save it here. We're going to do a push. If we go back to the server, let's look at this document first. Obviously, all the fields here are asterisks. Going back to the tool, run the sync, come back to the server. And there you go, right? So the field changed exactly what you expect. And obviously, if there are some specific rules within your sync gateway function, in your sync function, you can try all of that out, right? So for example, in our production server, we had a rule which says any document that does not have a field called type, I don't want to accept that document. So you could go in here, get rid of the type field, right? Sync that document up, and then what you want to see is that document should not sync to the server because your sync function should reject that change, right? Yeah, so that's how you would test. You have some features here. You can search a document. So I can just type in a document ID here, or I can just start typing a few digits of the document, and it should just pull that up. You can go reset your search here. There's an advanced search, right? You can put in some specific attributes, or you can match keywords here. There's a lot of stuff you can do with searches. You can go here, add new documents. You put in attachments if you want, and those attachments can sync to the server as well. So that's also an option. What it also can do is you can go in here to more and click on export documents, and then it'll let you export all of these documents in the database, in the CBLite database, to a text file or a JSON file. And that helps us a lot in production. So we have these situations where, for some reason, there's a problem with the device, it's not able to sync, or something just went wrong, right? So what we end up doing is extracting the CBLite file from that device. And once we have that, we can go into the settings. Instead of pointing it to my file, I can change it here and point it to some other database, right? So for example, I'm going to point it to MyDB over here, right? So for production, what you can do is go to settings, put in the name of a CBLite file here. And what you want to do is give the high level directory. So in this case, the directory containing the CBLite 2 file is what I would give. And then I put the name of the DB that I want to open, and then click on reload table, and it should bring up all the documents in that CBLite file, right? So this is a good way of looking at documents on your mobile device if you want to do that offline on a computer, right? And then obviously you can load all of these things here, go to more, export documents, and then export all these documents into a text file, into a JSON file. And the way this helps us is it exports it into the JSON line format, and then you can take that file, go into your Couchbase cluster, go into the import document section, click on that file, and you should be able to import the entire contents of the CBLite file into a bucket, right? And then you can just copy that data from this bucket into your production database or whatever you need to do with that, right? So that definitely helps us a lot when we run into issues. And then the last thing that I wanted to point out is the tool also works with Syn Gateway session tokens. So if you don't use basic auth username and password with Syn Gateway, and instead you're using the SG session token, you can always pass that session token here, right? And there's a nifty way to generate that as an SG token as well. So in case you have specified your admin URL in the settings, you should be able to go in here, just put in the username and say, generate token. And give me one moment. There's no database called MyDB on my Syn Gateway. It's MySGDB. I made that change. Generate the token for user Tom. Click on this. It should give me a Couchbase token. And then I can take this token, go in here. I'm going to delete the database first to begin with. Put this in here, and I should be able to sync, right, with the token instead of the credentials. So that works too. That's not something that is supported by the CBLite CLI tool. So in case you're using session-based authentication, this is your way out. Yeah, and then if you look at the sync channels, so right now the user Tom has access to a channel called exclamation mark, which is the public channel, right? And then he has access to asterisk, which means he has access to all the channels. But then if I give Tom access to some specific channels in Syn Gateway, and provided that you have configured the admin link here, this tool should be able to talk to Syn Gateway, pull the data from the _users API, and show you a list of channels that user Tom has access to. And then what you could do technically is come in here, say, hey, I want all channels, or rather all documents on the public channel. In this case, I'm going to sync. And like you see, there's no documents on the public channel, nothing synced, right? Obviously, that's what we would expect to happen. Let me just quickly go in here, and I'm going to reassign this document to the public channel. Save this here. Let's try this one more time. Hopefully, there we go. So this document now synced on the public channel, right? So if you want to test out specific channels, you can do that too, and that'll work as well. Yeah, so this is a good way to both support your production workloads or production issues, debug them, as well as do your functional testing, right? This is something that our QA testing teams are extensively using to do their testing with Syn Gateway. Yeah, so that's pretty much all that I had for you today, right? I hope that this session was informative and useful for you. Here at Infosys, we work on a lot of modernization projects. Like I said, we are a SI partner for Couchbase. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, or if you would like Infosys or Couchbase to help you with your next project. We're looking forward to that. I have my contact details here. Feel free to reach out to me in case you have any questions. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. I hope you found this informative and useful. Thanks.